2:00 a.m. Thursday, November the 8th, 1917. The place, St. Petersburg, Russia. The Red Guards of Lenin assaulted and captured the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government. That night, Lenin, in front of a crowded auditorium, delivered a speech in which he called for worldwide revolution. Shortly afterwards, the first Marxist-Leninist government was installed. That was the beginning of the train of events that would lead to the capture of 1/6 of the world's surface by communism. And it would lead ultimately to what is affecting each and every one of you in this room, to cultural Marxism and its strategy of political correctness, which is ruling Ireland, Europe, the entire Western world, and is extending through globalization everywhere. John Reed, an American journalist who took part in the revolution, in his book entitled 10 Days That Shook the World, had a remarkable insight which should say something to all of us here present. I quote, "Thursday, day broke. Superficially all was quiet. Hundreds of thousands of people retired at a prudent hour, got up early and went to work. The streetcars were running, the stores and restaurants open, theatres going, an exhibition of paintings advertised. All the complex routine of daily life, humdrum even in wartime, proceeded as usual." And he concluded with these remarkable words: "Nothing is so astounding as the vitality of the social organism, how it persists, feeding itself, clothing itself, amusing itself, in the face of the worst calamities." Indeed, history records that the masses of people instinctively either are unaware of the long-term implications of the political and cultural changes, or they turn a blind eye, or they follow a policy of appeasement with the threatening forces. Now, all of you here present today at the Round Towers Association, you are exceptions to the rule. You are awake and alert to the great threat of our era, to what Pope Benedict XVI entitled the dictatorship of relativism. Mighty is the importance, due to the scale of this radical social engineering, to have Catholics who are ready to play their part in resisting the dictatorship. Urgent is the need for Catholics who will begin, as a cultural Marxist leader, Rudi Deutsch, once stated, who will begin the long march through the institutions to create again a Catholic society. Europe, Ireland, indeed the entire world cries out for such Catholic vanguards. For men and women who identify with the words of one of the greatest figures who did not follow a policy of appeasement with threatening forces in the 20th century, Winston Churchill. On April the 3rd, 1936, this man who for 10 years was pushed to the peripheries of society, who suffered financial difficulties, scorn by the elites of England, said the following, I quote, "Such civilization as we have been able to achieve will become pulp and squalor. People must awaken. People who are chattering, busy, sporting, toiling, amused from day to day by headlines and from night to night by cinemas. Yet they are in a society that is slipping, sinking, rolling backwards to an age when the earth was void and darkness moved upon the face of the waters. And in a dramatic conclusion, the Lion of England thundered, "Surely it is worth a supreme effort, the laying aside of every impediment, the clear-eyed facing of fundamental facts, the noble acceptance of risks inseparable from heroic endeavour, to control the hideous drift of events and arrest calamity on the threshold. Stop it, stop it, stop it. Now is the appointed time." Nowadays, everything is at stake, far more so than in the 1930s, faced with Nazism. Because, as C.S. Lewis once wrote, the individualistic hedonism at the root of the dictatorship of relativism will, I quote Lewis, "will damn our souls and destroy our species." And that, as you know, is happening already. The demographic birth rates in Western Europe have fallen below replacement level. It is statistically proven by demographers that when a population falls beneath 1.9, that nation will never recover. Italy and Spain have fallen beneath that level. And so the importance of this series of conferences of the Round Towers Association. In other words, the restoration of Europe through Catholicism. Real Catholicism as distinct from fake Catholicism. Because Catholicism matters, not only to the individual soul, but to society's soul. Only a civilization founded on the truths of Catholicism has the intellectual clarity and supernatural guts to confront, combat, and overcome the fatalist ideology of the cultural Marxism running Ireland, Europe, and the Western world today. Therefore, we must equip creative Catholic minorities, because it was such Catholic vanguards who built Europe and Western civilization. The most beneficial, the most outstanding civilization in history, notwithstanding the defects of some of its members which are endemic to human nature. Part of this equipping will be the arming of Catholics with what Churchill called historical imagination. As the Jewish political theorist Isaiah Berlin stated, Mr. Churchill's dominant category, the single central organizing principle of his moral and intellectual universe, is an historical imagination so strong, so comprehensive, as to encase the whole of the present and the whole of the future in a framework of a rich and multicoloured past. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the purpose of the Round Towers Association's conference today, and also of my book, Heroism and Genius, to empower Catholics with this historical imagination. Because we Catholics have the same mission now in this second dark age as our forefathers did during the first dark ages. By discovering why and how we Catholics built a civilization during an age of relative darkness, we will realize that although the third millennium's circumstances are different from those of the first millennium, neither human nature nor real Catholicism have changed. What Catholics did before, they can do again. The outline of this first conference is as follows. 1. Firstly, I will briefly present the historical consensus among the leading historians about the role of Catholicism in building Western civilization, very briefly. Secondly, I will sketch rapid portraits of the leaders of the Catholic vanguards who led the struggle that brought Europe into existence. Firstly, then, the Catholic role in the building of the West. Historians within the past 100 years have resolutely asserted, often most reluctantly, that Catholics were the architects and the builders of the reality that became Europe. Catholicism was the keystone in the arch of this new civilization. Yes, there were other stones of Greek, Roman, Germanic, and of our beloved Jewish ancestors. However, the wedge-shaped stone that supported and locked all the other stones into shape, into position, allowing it to bear the weight of such integration, was Catholicism. Not, ladies and gentlemen, Christianity. Christianity has never existed except in people's minds. There has only existed a concrete reality called the Catholic Church and the breakaway groups from that Catholic Church. At the end of the centuries after the collapse of Rome, around the 13th century, as Sean mentioned, with the dawn of that century, it was evident to everybody that a most original and a most beautiful civilization had been born. Why? Because its culture was quintessentially Catholic in law, philosophy, the arts, architecture, and in mentality, in the minds of the elites and of the masses of people. This new culture brought with it, as Pope Benedict XVI stated, a new humanism, an authentic grammar of mankind and reality. One by one, historians have spotlighted Catholicism's key role. The Oxford professor R.W. Southern showed the role of Catholic scholastic thinkers such as Aquinas in creating the rational worldview of the West that gave birth to modern science. Pierre Duhem, the physicist and the historian of modern science, concluded that the Catholics of the Middle Ages placed the pillars for modern physics, and contemporary experts, Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, like David Lindbergh, Stanley Yaki, and Thomas Goldstein, have all agreed. In astronomy, Professor J.L. Heilbronn recognized the Church's pivotal function. In the development of education, A.F. West attributed a key role to the Church's influence during the reign of Charlemagne, when the first ever program of universal education was introduced by the Catholic layman Alcuin of York, an Englishman, but very much formed by the spirit of the Irish Celtic monks in his native England. In law, the scholar Harold Berman concluded that the template of modern legal systems lies in the Church's own canon law. And Francis Fukuyama, who is definitely not Catholic and definitely does not have the Catholic position, said exactly the same thing. In economics, John Gilchrist, Henri Pirenne, Fernand Braudel show that many of the key features of the free enterprise economic system came from Catholic thinkers. Joseph Schumpeter, perhaps the leading economist of the 20th century, in his monumental History of Economic Analysis, has pointed to the Catholics of the School of Salamanca as the thinkers who, I quote, come nearer than does any other group to having been the, listen to this, the founders of modern economics. And I could go on. As Chesterton, and only Chesterton could say this, once said, anything good in modern society is by origin Catholic. Therefore, history has spoken. The case is closed. At the top level of historians, that has not yet petered down to the classrooms of our secondary schools and even of our undergraduate history faculties very often. Very often because it has not been allowed to peter down by the enemies of Catholicism. Like it or not, facts are facts. Catholicism, through Catholic vanguards, lay the foundations of European culture and the civilization that grew out of that culture. Before identifying and sketching some of the key Catholic movers and shakers, it would be helpful to briefly recall the key events that shaped European history in the first millennium, the so-called Age of Darkness, which was not an age of darkness, but anyway. When Peter and Paul went to their martyrdoms in 67 AD, they left behind a vigorous young church that, even though it was being persecuted, was already determined to change the culture of the Roman Empire. They already, from the very beginning, had members of the Imperial Praetorian Guard, a number of senators, and some of the highest aristocratic, especially women, in Roman society. Amidst admiration, suspicion, and persecution, Catholics went from strength to strength in an empire that between the 1st and 5th centuries was growing senile, a white-haired world sinking rapidly into senility. Perhaps something similar to our contemporary society. The times after the fall of Rome, in which our forefathers were laying the foundations of this new society, were dramatic indeed. There were years of civil war between 235 and 284. In 378, the barbarians, the Visigoths, defeated the Roman army, absolutely unheard of for hundreds of years in Roman history. In 402, as a young Patrick in England, the future missionary of Celtic Ireland looked on, the Roman legions embarked on their ships, left England, and shortly afterwards the barbarian Angles and Jutes and Saxons invaded and took over the country, pushing us Celts over to Wales, Cornwall, and up to Scotland. Then on December the 3rd, 406, Vandals, Alans and Suevi crossed the frozen Rhine near Mainz after Roman troops had left to defend Italy and began rampaging through Gaul, Spain and North Africa. Then the event that shook the entire Roman world. Visigoths under Alaric attacked Rome in 410, and the entire West shuddered as the city fell. On September the 4th, 476, the last Western Roman emperor, the teenager Romulus Augustus, took the road to the south after being deposed by the barbarian Odoacer. By 554, the 30-year war between the Eastern Emperor Justinian and the barbarians left behind a devastated Italy. The proud city of Rome, that had once boasted a population of 1 million, was now reduced to 40,000 people, a skeleton of its former glory. In the midst of relentless butchery and chaos, even the possibility of death by plague rather than by the rampant mutilations and other types of torture was preferred by the leading figure of the age, Gregory the Great. Night, indeed, had fallen over Western Europe. During the 5th to the 7th centuries, Western Europe resembled Mordor, a dying land not yet dead, as Tolkien stated. Men fluctuated between frenzy and hopelessness. How could the age-old civilization of Rome be conquered by barbarians? Even that tough, choleric individual, St. Jerome, fell momentarily into agony in that momentous year of 410 when Rome fell. I quote him, "My voice fails me, sobs choke my words." End quote. What was left of the glorious civilization? In the face of universal decay and events seemingly masterminded by satanic powers, hope was fast disappearing from the hearts of men, as is happening today. In anguish, they looked around for a meaning to it all, for an overarching purpose that would somehow make sense of all that was happening around them, that would somehow vanquish the relentless waves of evil that were assaulting the shores of society and the shores of their own hearts. It was then, in those darkest of hours, that Catholicism stepped into the breach and proved herself to be the worldview, the only worldview that can provide light and energy in man's soul for such hours. Because Catholicism is the religion for the darkest hours. With our eyes fixed on the North Star of history, the unchanging one, our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ, truth, life and way, she resolutely taught Romans and barbarians the great certainties of Catholicism. With these truths, the Church showed the men and women of the Dark Ages, whether Roman patricians or Anglo-Saxon chieftains, that her reason for existing was to communicate the divinely revealed purpose of history. She thus restored hope, empowering men to face their present, no matter how terrible. Moreover, she taught Romans and invaders that there could be not only a renaissance of ancient Rome, but a birth of a better civilization, a Catholic civilization. 5th century Catholic intellectuals, such as Paul Orosius in his Universal History, pointed out that this construction of a new world order required, first of all, making the divinely revealed certainties found in the Catholic religion and its supernatural energy found in her sacraments, the foundations of the human heart and of society. The strategy of these Catholic vanguards, these tiny minorities, was transparently clear. The proactive proposal of conversion to the Catholic faith of all non-Catholics. During that long night, from the 5th to the 10th century, in a saga of ceaseless heroism, Catholic vanguards won over the Celts and the barbarian races to the one true faith. In the 400s, thanks largely to Patrick, the Celts of Ireland became Catholic. In 496, Remy, Bishop of Reims in France, christened Clovis, King of the Franks. In 500, Avitus, Bishop of Vienne, friend and mentor of King Sigismund of the Burgundians, received him along with thousands of his warriors into the church. Then came D-Day for Europe. In 575, Columbanus and the Celtic monks, 12 of them, disembarked on the shores of Brittany. And as Daniel Rups, the member of the Académie Française, said, like flashes of lightning, They crossed France, travelled up the Rhine into Switzerland and northern Italy, preaching, founding abbeys, and initiating the revitalization of the local churches that were only partly evangelized by previous generations. England became Catholic thanks partly to Augustine of Canterbury, but more especially, although it hasn't been pointed out by many historians, more especially because of Aidan, the Irish monk from the island of Iona. Boniface in Germany. Then on Christmas Day 800, Pope Leo III, at the end of the traditional Latin Mass, crowned Charlemagne as emperor, restoring thus, in a certain sense, the Roman Empire in the West, but with a mighty difference. Now it was in its ideals a Catholic empire, thanks largely to the brain behind the throne of Charlemagne, the Catholic Alcuin of York. There was still much work to be done, however. Much of Europe was still pagan and hostile, extremely hostile to Catholicism. Notably, the North, Scandinavia. The North was impenetrable to Catholics for centuries. The hostile Vikings inspired such terror in the Catholics of the 9th century that they added a prayer to the liturgy. From the fury of the Northmen, rescue us, O Lord. Finally, one resolute missionary succeeded. The man whose nickname was the Apostle of the North, Ansgar, whose name actually means God's javelin, in the 800s penetrated into Denmark and Sweden, time and again meeting defeat, but finally gathering together a small band of Swedish Catholics, which included some of the elite of Sweden, at Lake Mälaren. Within 200 years, Sweden was Catholic. To Iceland, Catholics arrived in 874, since at least 40 of the original 400 Vikings from Norway included Irish Catholic slaves. And those Irish sure made a job of Iceland. Within 200 years, Iceland became fervently Catholic. Finally, by around 1450, the last holdout, Lithuania, became part of Christendom, Christian Europe, Catholic Europe. During these centuries, due to the absence of the political, legal, and military stability that Rome had given to the lands that jutted out of the Asian mainland, this mass of land resembled a ship on unknown seas lashed by high waves. It was Catholicism, led by some extraordinary men, and behind those extraordinary men, of course, there were extraordinary women. This became the institution capable of taking command of the rudder of society and navigating, because only Catholicism had a clear sense of the direction these peoples should be taking in order to reach a haven of social order. In the vacuum of civil leadership, it was particularly the bishops who shouldered responsibility for society, for within their ranks were to be found many of the heirs of either imperial officials or of converted barbarian leaders. Extraordinary men. Overachieving youths were attracted to the ranks of the priesthood in those centuries, because the priesthood was an energetic, determined group of men who led the way courageously, heroically, in building up every single dimension of society. Perhaps their view of their role is best symbolized in the action of Bishop Rigobert of Rheims in the 700s, who, in order to ensure that the people of his city were safe at night, used to sleep near the ramparts of the city with the keys of the city gates right beside him. It is simply impossible to list all of those extraordinary men. Some 9,000 place names in France, 4,500 in Spain, 2,500 in Italy, witness to their influence. But among all of the great Catholic leaders, 4 stand out. Giants of thought and action who did much to lay the foundations of the Europe we are living in today. The Europe that even our enemies, the enemies of Catholicism, benefit from. These 4 men, whom the historian Christopher Dawson declared to be the fathers of Western culture, are Ambrose, Augustine, Leo the Great, Gregory the Great. First of all, Ambrose. Ambrose was a Roman aristocrat born around 338, who rapidly rose in the ranks of the Roman governing elite to become governor of northern Italy, the area around Milan. Ultimately, he became bishop of that city. And as a man of government in the church, he made the deepest impression on the imagination of the West for 2 millennia. Why? Because he carried out his duties as bishop to their extreme implications, showing the church and society that bishops and priests are not meant to be sacristy figures, but they are meant to stand on the front steps of the church and proclaim to society its obligations in politics, economics, and culture. To be defenders of the city, because first of all they are defenders of the faith. Ambrose was an aristocrat, a man of refined tact, a friend of the emperors Gratian and Theodosius, but that man was a fighter. He firmly asserted, I quote, "The emperor is in the church, not above it." And therefore, he added, I quote, "When kings make mistakes, bishops must not fail to correct them with just reprimands." Ambrose burnt the lesson into the memory of the Western world for 2,000 years, when, through his confrontation with Emperor Theodosius the Great in November 390, he excommunicated the really good emperor, but a rather hot-headed, choleric individual. Why? Because he had ordered the massacre of thousands of innocent people in Thessalonica as a reprisal for an assault on his troops. Ambrose told him that he would only be allowed to enter the church. There was no question of receiving Holy Communion if he did public penance for his sin. He wrote to Theodosius, "You shall then make your offering when you have received my permission to participate in the holy sacrifice, when your offering will be acceptable to God." After a month's delay, in which the entire Western world held its breath, when shocked aristocrats throughout Italy urged the Emperor of Rome, the most powerful individual in the entire world, the only other individual comparable to him being the Han Emperor in China, urged him not to humiliate himself in public, something that no emperor in all of Rome's history had ever done. And yet, after a month's delay, the ruler of the Roman Empire in the square of Milan took off his imperial robes, put on the purple robes of a penitent, walked barefoot through the square and up the steps of that basilica, into that basilica where he knelt and asked for the absolution of Bishop Ambrose. Ambrose, in the sermon at the emperor's funeral in 395, said the following: stripping himself of every emblem of royalty, he publicly in church deplored his sin. That public penance which private individuals shrink from, an emperor was not ashamed to perform, nor was there afterwards a day in which he did not grieve for his mistake. When Theodosius was approaching his death, he called for Ambrose to be beside him, to help him cross the final frontier. And Ambrose in the sermon said, even as death was approaching, the emperor was more concerned about the welfare of the Catholic Church than about his own personal danger. The submission of Theodosius was one of the most stunning and symbolic moments of all world history. The painting of the event by Sublera depicts men looking on in staggered amazement at the sight of Theodosius kneeling before Ambrose, as indeed they might. That dramatic scene of a bishop's hand raised in absolution and an emperor dressed in penitential purple kneeling before him show the entire ancient world turned upside down. The successors of bishops who only 80 years before had been thrown to the lions in amphitheaters across the Roman world now judged the emperors in their basilicas. The Caesars, who had often acted as if I am the state, now recognized that they themselves were subjects to the laws of God, to the natural law, and accepted that the Catholic Church was its custodian. It was nothing less than a massive socio-cultural political revolution. The second figure is Augustine, a Berber, a Numidian of North Africa. Although we have no description of his appearance, it is not unlikely that he was a typical member of his race, tall, long-limbed, with bronze skin, a high forehead, and striking black eyes. Brilliant and hot-blooded, this wild youth became one of the great intellectual leaders, in fact, the great intellectual leader in the first millennium. But he was no ivory tower intellectual. Each Sunday, the excited crowds of his city went to the basilica to hear him preach. They loved that man because they knew that he loved them. As he himself said, I quote, "I do not wish to be saved without you." And he added, "Why am I here in this world? Not only to live in Jesus Christ, but to live in him with you. This is my passion, my honor, my glory, my joy, my riches." Seated in the sanctuary at a distance of only 5 yards from the first row of his audience, Augustine well knew that his fellow North Africans would only enter into his ideas if he first entered into their passions, because they were a passionate people. So he would start out talking about the problems that worried them, talking in a straightforward manner, pleasing their North African love of subtlety in language, holding them spellbound with his ability to reason out a biblical text as if it were a riddle, becoming emotional about what moved them and him: happiness, love, fear, guilt, peace, more than once reducing them, grown men and women, to tears. At times they would interrupt him to finish off one of his biblical texts. Other times they applauded. Sometimes they even griped when he gave out to them for following semi-pagan practices. As the sermon went on, Augustine, who had a frail voice, would ask for a moment's silence to try and recover his voice. The love of God, the hope springing from union with our Lord Jesus Christ, the urgency of conversion, solidarity with the suffering, including those in purgatory, the role of the Catholic heroes and heroines who had preceded them. These were what he talked about. And all the while he lived a simple life in a monastery. There he, with the priests who surrounded him, renounced personal property and lived austerely. Plain furnishings, no silver cutlery except spoons, dishes of wood, stone or earthenware, eating together their meals of bread and vegetables with a little wine while listening to a reading or discussing matters of the Spirit. His final days were spent in overcrowded Hippo, whose streets were jammed with refugees seeking a safe haven from the fury of Genseric's red-haired vandals, who everywhere they went maimed, raped, savaged. On August the 28th, 430, the third month of the siege of his beloved city, Augustine, his weary body racked by pain and fever, died. As death approached, he had prayed, asking God for pardon for having done so little for him. Time and again reading aloud the words of the penitential psalms that he had nailed to the walls of his cell. But he had remained in that city, besieged by those vandals. He had urged his fellow citizens to resist them, to fight. He had stood up to priests who were tempted to run and told them, "Your duty is to remain, even unto death." He put nerve into the people. He put nerve into their leaders. And he put nerve into the Catholic vanguards for the following 1,000 years as they worked ceaselessly through the long night of darkness to build a new civilization. He did this through his writings principally, especially the City of God. That book became the bedside book of the man whom historians recognize built the first Europe, Charlemagne, the Emperor Charlemagne. But he also immediately influenced the two individuals who in between him and Charlemagne were the most influential, Pope Leo the Great and Pope Gregory the Great. Leo, as a young priest, had once met him. Leo changed the course of European history as Pope in the year 452, 22 years after Augustine's death. Italy was in turmoil. The imperial armies were everywhere in retreat because Attila the Hun and his fierce hordes were pouring southwards through the peninsula. In desperation, the Emperor Valentinian III turned to the Pope and asked Leo to somehow try to stop Attila. Leo was a born leader of men, serene, inspiring serenity, but tough as nails. An orator whose words moved both the learned and the uneducated, with a mind capable of pinpointing precise solutions to the most complex problems. This was the man who rode out on horseback, unarmed, to confront Attila the Hun on the banks of the Mincio River near the city of Mantua. The French historian Henri Daniel Rups described the meeting as follows. Attila was just preparing to cross the Mincio when he saw a strange procession advancing toward him, shrouded in a cloud of gold-tinted dust, incense. Priests in dalmatics, monks in coarse wool clothing, 2 Roman aristocrats on horseback, and a host of deacons and choristers bearing crosses and banners and lifting high gold monstrances which gleamed in the sunlight, were marching slowly towards Attila. From the entire column, the rhythmical responses of hymns and psalms rose on high, swelling into a formidable chorus. In the midst of the procession rode an old man with a white beard, praying as he rode. Attila galloped toward the river, urged his horse into it, and halted on a sandy bank in the middle of it, within hailing distance of the strangers. He shouted, "What is your name?" to the old man, evidently the leader. Then came the answer, "I am Leo the Pope." The singing had stopped. Attila hesitated for a moment, then urging his horse forward into the water again, gained the far bank, and the Pope came forward to meet him. And that is all we know for certain about the event. All that Leo would tell the Emperor Valentinian on his return, apparently, "Let us give thanks to God, for he has delivered us from great danger." But that event marked a significant change in European history, because it showed the Western barbarians and Romans that a new defender of Rome, of Europe's cities and countryside, had appeared in place of the old emperors, in place of the Byzantine emperors. That power now resided in the unarmed figures of the Roman pontiffs. As a result of this prestige of the papacy was now in a position to begin the conversion of the barbarians in depth. Leo's successor, Gregory, an individual whom the non-Catholic mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead described as a man whose high official position is surpassed only in the magnitude of his services to humanity. Gregory was an aristocrat who renounced wealth, pomp, everything this world has, to become a monk. And he wanted to remain a monk, but he was too talented. The Pope, who realized that this former governor of Rome would be a valuable helper, and indeed probably hoped his successor would be his successor, made him his right-hand man, and ultimately Gregory succeeded him and began immediately the conversion of the barbarians, sending Augustine to England, sending other missionaries to the Lombards, where he was aided by a wonderful woman, one of the many extraordinary women who played such a key role in the conversion of Europe, the beautiful Bavarian princess Theodelinda, Queen of the Barbarians. She, like the Parisian princess Queen Bertha, who was married to the King of Kent in England, played an extraordinary role in getting their husbands into shape and fostering the conversion of their nations. Gregory was a hot-tempered man, but a just man, a great ruler, a man who inspired love in the population of the Roman people, a man who, as his biographer stated, never rested. He was a man of frail health, embarrassed by the fact that he couldn't keep the austere rules of fasting because of the fact that he would faint if he kept them. Even in his old age, in bed with gout and suffering tremendous pain, he worked non-stop, mapping out the conversion of all of England on the basis of the reports he was receiving from Augustine and his monks. As a result, Gregory decisively ensured that the Benedictine and Celtic monks would energetically pioneer the conversion of the barbarians. The Benedictine monks we're all familiar with. But the Celtic monks, especially the Irish monks, in many ways played a more decisive immediate role in the conversion of the barbarians. They were in many ways the shock troops. They were so tremendously austere and so tremendously cultured, an extraordinary combination, that they impressed the barbarian leaders enormously. Enormously. On the coast of northern France, in 575, Columbanus, the leader of the Celtic monks, accompanied by 12 men, disembarked. The trail that he blazed across France, the Rhinelands, Switzerland, northern Italy, was the area that would become the heartlands of the 8th century Carolingian Empire. Columbanus inspired or founded some 200 monasteries, and it was these monasteries that were the nerve centers of the new culture that would become the center and the foundation of what became Western civilization. It is hard to know what quality to admire most in Columbanus, and with this I am drawing towards my conclusion. His daring spirit, or the sublime and tender sensitivity evident in his letters. This man who in his youth, as his biographer records, was pursued by more than one young woman, and who felt greatly the attraction of their presence. Columbanus, by all accounts, had a larger-than-life personality. As he travelled through Europe, wherever he went, like all the Celtic monks, he could easily be seen approaching. He wore a long white habit, carried a curved staff, and had a water bottle and pouch containing relics of the saints hanging from around his neck. Whether before kings or before ordinary people, I quote, "The man whose eyes were the colour of grey sea water, whose voice was strong and melodic, whose hair, tonsured in the Celtic style, fell behind unto his shoulders, inspired all." As Daniel Rups described him, I quote, "This bearded, gnarled giant, with muscles of steel, who could fell a tree with one blow of his axe and dig the soil for 15 hours on end without showing any signs of fatigue. Yes, he was a rugged man who landed on the northern shores of France, a kind of Israelite prophet walking the 6th century earth, a man as plain-spoken as Isaiah or Jeremiah, on whose face, so the biographer assures us, the might of God was clearly seen. A great walker, a great preacher, a tireless pioneer, a healer, and almost a soothsayer, and yet a man whose Irish ancestry had left him his sense of poetry and mystery, his love of nature and of daydreaming. And I conclude, his achievement can only be described as colossal, as Dr. O'Hara will unfold in his lecture, and the ultimate implications of which Dr. Alan Philister will present to us. He was followed by others. He was followed by Alcuin of York, the intellectual power behind Charlemagne, the individual who initiated the forging of a Christian synthesis of the Roman and the Teutonic and Celtic cultures that brought about the birth of the first Europe in the 9th century, and ultimately the Europe, the socio-cultural political unity that exists today in the 13th century. In conclusion, the saga of how our Catholic forefathers, lay the foundations of the Catholic civilization that became Western civilization, shows us clearly today, at the beginning of the third millennium, that history is the essence of innumerable biographies. Carlyle. History is the essence of innumerable biographies. In other words, that history is made by men and women who are determined to make a difference. This is the view of history that thunders to us Catholics today. Remember as you stand at a crossroads of history. Remember as you confront the dictatorship of relativism. Remember who you are and what your ancestors once achieved. Recall the crucially important consequences of Catholicism, not only for your own soul, but for the soul of society. Never forget that the Catholic, by being truly Catholic, changes himself, society, civilization, that you cannot fail to change the world by being truly Catholic.